Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Past and Printed, the show where we take a look at a newspaper from today's date, from a randomly chosen city, in a randomly chosen year, to see what the everyday person was reading about and what was going on in their world. This time, our selection algorithm has landed us in North Dakota, or more accurately, Dakota Territory, where we're looking at the Wednesday, December 17th, 1884 edition of the Emmons County Record. Now, for most of its publishing run, the record has been printed and published in Linton, the current county seat of Emmons County. However, in 1884, the paper was printed in Williamsport, a town which no longer exists. So, that being the case, our quick facts and history will be a little bit different today. Williamsport was established in 1883 in northern Emmons County, about 3 miles northeast of the current town of Hazleton, by a group of settlers originally from Ashland, Ohio. The town is named for their first postmaster, Daniel Williams. Emmons County itself is located in the southern portion of North Dakota, and for reference, the current county seat of Linden, in the central part of the county, is about 60 miles southeast of Bismarck. According to Prairie Public Radio, Williamsport grew quickly, and by 1884 boasted 2 stores, a blacksmith, a hotel, a law office, and of course, the Emmons County Record. Williamsport at the time seemed like a sure bet. It was quickly designated the seat of Emmons County, and lots in the town were being sold for up to $150, which is about $5,000 in 2025, but really doesn't reflect how much the price of real estate has outpaced the rest of inflation, but it was a lot for the time, okay? Williamsport's prominence was to be short-lived. In 1897, the Northern Pacific Railroad proposed a line that would bypass the town, and in 1898, the final blow came when the Sioux Line built their railroad to Braddock, just a few miles from Williamsport. It then became clear that the town would not be getting a railroad and would be served only by a stagecoach line, which was not competitive by the turn of the 20th century. The town of Linton was laid out that same year in the geographic center of the county, and less than 3 weeks later was named the new county seat, which it remains to this day. Meanwhile, within months of the Sioux Line's decision, many of the buildings in Williamsport had been torn down, and the county jailhouse, which had been built for $3,000, was sold off for $70,000. That's like going from about $100,000 to $2,700 in 2025, so quite the drop in value. And then in 1903, the post office closed, marking the end of Williamsport. Today, all that remains is apparently a pile of stones in a field, the remnants of some of the few buildings that weren't demolished or removed by 1903. I wasn't able to find an accurate population for Williamsport during its heyday, although the town's population was apparently 244 in 1900, when the town was in decline, so I'm guessing the population was similar or maybe even higher during its boom times during the 1880s and 90s. But for reference, in 1885, Emmons County as a whole had a population of about 1,200 and 1,971 in 1890, and as of 2024, had an estimated population of 3,209. And by the way, in 1884, the founder, editor, and publisher of the Emmons County Record was Darwin Reed Streeter. And with that, let's go ahead and dive into the first page of the Wednesday, December 17th, 1884 edition of the Emmons County Record. On the front page of the paper, 3 out of 6 columns are taken up with advertisements, almost exclusively for businesses in Bismarck, which makes sense since it was the largest commercial hub of the area, and many people in Williamsport would have done business in Bismarck. Most of the 4th column is also related to commerce in Bismarck, including a directory of businesses by category, including grocers, attorneys, hotels, physicians, homeopathic physicians, and a, quote, New York art dealer, unquote. There are a couple of ads for Williamsport professionals, including 2 separate attorneys and George Walker's brand new blacksmith shop. Besides the ads, the front page seems to be devoted to local county news and business. For example, we've got a summons notifying a J.H. Stevenson that he is to appear before Justice of the Peace John Kurtz to answer a claim that has been filed against him by a George Docherty for $37. That is about $1,200 in 2025. And the case is relating to an unpaid account for an overcoat and merchandise delivered by Docherty to Stevenson. However, the notice is a bit out of date, as Stevenson was meant to appear in court on November 25th, and of course this is the December 17th edition of the paper. There's a little notice that, according to D.H. Yeater, nearly 4 times as much land has been broken for farming in 1884 in the Williamsport area as in 1883. The exact numbers are 2,017 acres broken in 1884 versus 575 in 1883. The 5th column of the paper is titled In Town and Out and contains news snippets and some musings about local goings-on, including that Mr. David Yeater left for a trip to Bismarck on Tuesday. The Bismarck Brewery is rapidly approaching completion. The silent partner in the publication of the record is visiting the Capitol. I believe this to be a bit of a cheeky reference to the editor's wife, Mrs. Mary Josephine Streeter, who was actually responsible for collecting the advertisements to be printed in the paper, which is probably why she was in Bismarck at the time. Dakota Territory's population is now 430,000, an increase of 184,000 in 2 years. Mr. Worst and Packer are in Bismarck, with Mr. Worst acting as a witness in the case of Griffin v. Packer. The jury in the McGill murder case recently on trial in Bismarck disagreed. They stood 6 for conviction and the same number for acquittal. This is the trial of Thomas McGill, who was arrested for shooting and killing blacksmith Melville Bessie in the small town of Menokin on October 21st. McGill had claimed that the killing was in self-defense. Then here the record boasts that in the most recent U.S. elections, Dakota Territory cast over 80,000 votes, noting that this is more than Delaware, Nevada, Oregon, Colorado, and Rhode Island, apparently. Although this does illustrate how raw numbers can be deceptive, as at the time the populations of these states were quite a bit lower than Dakota Territory, and without going too in the weeds, when looking at them on a per capita basis, it appears that about 19% of Dakota Territory's population voted, which actually puts it on par with Delaware and behind Oregon, Colorado, and Nevada. Charles Anderson had 32 chickens destroyed recently in one night by a mink. Mr. Anderson managed to corner the animal in a nail keg and dispatched it. During the past week, progress has been made at the coal mine belonging to Charles Edick near Williamsport. The shaft has been sunk and the hoisting of coal is expected within a day or two. The Burleigh County Grand Jury, Burleigh being the county that Bismarck is in, has, quote, found an indictment against Ainsley for the murder of George Gibbs, unquote. Bond was declared forfeited and a warrant issued for his arrest. This is referring to J.C. Ainsley, originally a resident of Liverpool, Ohio, who had been arrested for shooting Bismarck resident George Gibbs on June 9th. Apparently, Ainsley had been in the area buying bones, probably to be used in making fertilizer or charcoal back east, and shot Gibbs after an argument. Apparently, Mr. Gibbs was one of a number of men who had hauled bones for Mr. Ainsley and had not been properly paid for his services. Apparently, the record is making plans to have a correspondent at every post office in the county and states that, quote, having your neighborhood represented in the pages of the county paper should be a matter of interest to every citizen. While this is admirable, it seems a bit ambitious for a paper not even a year old. The record also encourages citizens of the county not to make any arrangements for New Year's other than attending the party in Williamsport given by Mr. Dan Williams. This one is purely commentary from the editor. Quote, "The Williamsport settlement is over a year old, and there is no lack here of pretty girls and bright young men. Yet St. Paul's advice has not been followed in a single instance. This is not as it should be. Let our young folks take pattern by Glencoe," unquote. This is referring to a biblical quote from St. Paul, who said, "It is better to marry than to burn." And so following St. Paul's advice was apparently a Victorian-era euphemism for getting married and having children. The paper clearly believes that the town's young men and women need to hurry up and get married and start having kids, and apparently the people of neighboring town Glencoe are excelling in that regard. Here, the editor pokes a little fun at prominent citizens, Commissioner David Yeater and Judge George Docherty, both mentioned earlier, stating that they're heading out on a hunting trip soon. He says the commissioner stopped by the record office to borrow their mallet. He intends to kill up close, which will be far less dangerous to the trees than using a gun. The editor says, quote, "When they return, the editor man will feast continuously, 3 times a day for 7 weeks on deer meat. Perhaps." In further county news, a group of young people visited Williamsport from Glencoe on December 5th to attend a dance. On the return trip, the 2 hind wheels of their buggy came off, but luckily no one was injured. A party of hunters has also left Glencoe for the Little Missouri country, that is, the Little Missouri River in western North Dakota. The people of Glencoe wish them good luck and hope to share in the bear, elk, and venison on their return. The party consists of Frank Burt, John Robinson, John Toome, Mr. Roten, and Scouts Red Tomahawk and Spread Eagle. They expect to return in a month or so, unquote. Near Livonia, a Mr. O'Neill, his wife, and sister-in-law arrived at Mr. Wesley Baker's a few days ago. They have come directly from Ireland, and the women are sisters of Mrs. Baker. They both seem taken with Dakota Territory and will probably make Emmons County their future home. School will commence soon in the Livonia district with Mr. J. N. Thompson as school teacher. In Spink County, now in South Dakota, there is a continuing conflict over which town shall be the county seat. Ashton has apparently been the county's seat up until now, but Redfield has recently claimed the title after discovering election irregularities from 2 years earlier. To try and cement their claim, masked men from Redfield apparently went to Ashton and stole the county records. In response, a mob of 500 traveled from Ashton to Redfield and camped outside the town. Out of fear that Redfield might soon be attacked by the Ashtoners, the governor of the territory telegraphed for aid, and men of the territorial militia were called up and arrived in Redfield. To quote the paper, quote, "Wiser counsels prevailed, and the territorial press was robbed of a mammoth sensation," unquote. Redfield would eventually become the county seat for good in 1886. Finally, with the words of "Christmas, come one, come all," the record encourages the general public to attend the Christmas celebrations to be held at the Williamsport Schoolhouse on Christmas Eve. The event will start at 7 p.m. and consist of several literary readings, followed by a supper, for which there will be no charge. Anyone wishing to contribute to the supper is advised to deliver their contributions to the storeroom of H.D. Connor on or before December 23rd. And with that festive announcement, we reach the end of page 1. So, where page 1 of the Emmons County Record was mostly ads and business listings, page 2 is 100% written content. Starting out on the first column, we've got a collection of snippets and, I guess, random items of interest. I'll just read a few. There lives in Forsyth, Georgia, an old gentleman who is now in his 79th year. He was converted in 1833, licensed to preach in 1840, and has been preaching ever since. He never served on a jury, never was sued, never saw a horse race nor a theater, never saw a game of cards, never saw a dance, not even at a corn shucking, nor was he ever drunk. He has 12 children and lives a happy, peaceful life. Really, he's never even seen a game of cards, and no dancing even at a corn shucking. To each their own, but it certainly doesn't sound like the life for me. An interesting fact in natural history is announced by Cavalier Morath, an Italian civil engineer. While engaged in prospecting for water in Italy, Mr. Morath tapped a spring with a drive well and, to his surprise, pumped out of it a tiny living fish. The fish has passed from the spring through the perforations in the pump, 1/8 of an inch in diameter. It was found to be destitute of eyes, showing that it belonged to a subterranean species. A new kind of entertainment has just sprung up in New York society, which promises to afford considerable amusement and pleasure to those who take part in it. It is phrenology. Some people I know of, says a writer, intend the coming winter to give phrenological parties. That is, to have a phrenologist come to their houses and amuse their friends by feeling the protuberances on the craniums of those who will submit to it. So, phrenology had largely been discredited by the 1840s, so this piece isn't introducing phrenology as a new idea, but literally as a kind of parlor trick and game. However, in about 20 years' time, phrenology would experience a resurgence, especially in the fields of criminology and anthropology, as well as psychology, where it did kind of spur thoughts about focusing on the mind when it came to education and the rehabilitation of criminals, and even actually played a part in the evolution of modern psychology. However, it was also used to promote similarly pseudo-scientific racial, ethnic, and gender theories, i.e. the supremacy of Europeans, especially males, even into the 1930s. But in 1884, it was apparently just all the craze amongst the society folks to have their friends' craniums measured and see who had the most concentrativeness or who had the greatest love of approbation. Moving on, the Internal Revenue Department reports that the amount of beer which paid taxes in this country last year was 588 million gallons. I assume they mean on which taxes were paid. Adding to this, the amount exported and evading the tax brings the total up to 600 million gallons. This makes the United States the third in the list of beer-producing countries in the world. They go on to note that while there aren't near as many breweries as in some other countries, Americans are brewing on a much greater scale. For example, apparently U.S. brewers produce about 2/3 as much beer as in England, but England at the time had nearly 10 times as many breweries. The piece says that England makes more beer than any country, with 27,000 breweries turning out 999 million gallons yearly. Germany is in second place with 25,000 breweries making about 900 million gallons. And of course, the US is in third with about 3,000 breweries producing the aforementioned 600 million gallons of beer per annum. To put that in perspective, in 2024, according to the Brewers Association, the US had 9,922 breweries producing about 23 billion gallons of beer. Up next, the record quotes the New Journal of Commerce in speaking of runaway marriages. They say that parents who have acquired large wealth and high social position are often disappointed in the disposition of their daughters because of the ideal they insist upon and by which they measure all applicants for alliance. The daughter who recently married the coachman, it is said, was denied by her father the attentions of worthier men because they were not possessed of the fortune and social rank he had fixed as the standard. So basically, her dad kept holding out for a suitor that was rich enough for his standards, so she ran off with one of their servants. Continuing with the quote, they say, "We know an only daughter, now over 20 years of age and unmarried because her father, possessed of considerable means, has driven away all suitors, lest they should come wooing for his wealth." So basically, she's over 40 and unmarried, gasp, all because her father was paranoid that anyone who wanted to marry her just wanted his money. And the article just kind of stops there, but, I think you get the point. The third column of the page is taken up entirely with a piece titled "An Imperial Monster, Facts about a Great Ruler Who is Half Hog and Half Tiger," and which is lifted from the St. Louis Globe Democrat. What this is a highly critical, though historically dubious, overview of the life of Russian Tsar Peter the Great, who lived from 1672 to 1725 and ruled from 1682 until 1721. While the writer of this piece does give Peter some credit as an organizer and ruler, he also emphasizes accounts from Voltaire and another writer named Macaulay to paint the Tsar as a half-savage, living like a pig in a sty and prone to violent outbursts. There are numerous anecdotes portraying Peter the Great as crude and destructive, smashing luxurious palaces and property on drunken benders, beating courtiers and servants indiscriminately, and humiliating foreign dignitaries by whipping them in their own homes. The article also talks about how he had his own son, Alexei, tortured to death for, quote, some offense of no great seriousness, unquote. The writer then continues with more accounts of drunken debauchery, indiscriminate torture, sessions, and executions, including that of a mistress, Miss Mary Hamilton, who was accused of killing their newborn illegitimate child. The author basically concludes that Peter the Great was, in actuality, a gluttonous booze-hound of a tyrant whose extreme cruelty and penchant for violence far overshadow his political achievements. Of course, I'm no expert on Russian history, but I did do a little extra research, and it seems like historians agree that he did use violence as a punishment. He was quite fond of drinking. He actually founded a drinking club when he was 18, and did preside over the torture of his ex-wife and the execution of his son and former mistress. However, there doesn't seem to be any support for the idea that he was this cartoonishly villainous or chaotic, slovenly drunkard that the writer presents. And plus his son was accused of being part of a plot to overthrow the Tsar, which, in my opinion, doesn't condone torture and execution, but the article makes it sound like he just broke a face or something. All these exaggerations are likely just products of the sensational writing of the time, meant to shock and draw in readers, combined with anti-Russian propaganda that was quite common in the 18th and 19th centuries. So yeah, Peter the Great, complex historical figure, but not quite as debauched as this article would have us believe. Moving on, there is a piece titled Home Gymnastics, which argues that many of the quote-unquote physical shortcomings of women and girls, i.e. round shoulders, stooped posture, and flat chests, can be corrected by simple daily exercises performed either in the fresh air or a well-ventilated room. The writer describes such maneuvers as deep breathing, swinging the arms backward until they touch behind the shoulders, bending to touch your toes, and lifting the arms into various positions. These are to be performed vigorously twice a day for 15 minutes and will allegedly give any woman who does so, quote, a full chest, straight shoulders, and sound lungs, unless her case is so far advanced as to be incurable, unquote. Of course, men can do these exercises too, but of course the article notes, as a rule, men do not need them in anything like the same degree as women. Then the piece goes on to admonish women for trying to use corsets or patent medicines and nostrums to achieve what can be done through simple physical exertion. And in principle, yes, physical exercise is good for you, man or woman. It's just the way that this article is written makes this advice sound, I don't know, shallow, patronizing. I'm not sure the word. It just sounds off. Plus, they're very focused on increasing the size of women's chests. I'm just going to read the last full paragraph of the article here. Quote, in addition to the beauty given to the figure by the full chest, the increase of lung power will serve to vitalize every organ in the body, and will bring with it a clear eye, good blood, a fair complexion, a springy step, high spirits, and a capacity for enjoyment unknown before. An addition of 3 inches of girth to the chest means an additional 50 inches of surface in the air cells of the lungs, unquote. So you see, being bustier won't just make you more attractive, it'll make you better in every way. And immediately after that education in exercise and its effect on the feminine physique comes an article titled Embonpoint, the advantages and causes of adipose, how the lean may grow fat. Embonpoint being a term meaning plumpness, specifically like an attractive plumpness or voluptuousness. Curvy, we might say today, or thick with 2 C's. Aside from getting some insight into what editor Darwin Streeter finds attractive in women, we have here an article that manages to be both body positive and body shaming all at once. It starts out by declaring that fat is, quote, a veritable godsend to homely women, for it covers up the bones, rounds off the sharp angles, and gives a solidity to the figure that is at once commanding and attractive, unquote. They also declare that plumpness offers a defense against the ravages of time, that, quote, fat people never look old and positively refuse to get wrinkled, unquote. In fact, a little extra weight makes your whole life better, with the writer stating, quote, fat people may not live any longer than their bony, skinny neighbors, but while they do live, they are healthier, happier, and handsomer, if not wittier and wiser, unquote. So that's all well and good, but here's where they start adding some kind of cringe-worthy caveats. First off, they say, quote, it is one thing to get fat, but it is quite another problem to remain in that blissful condition and neither subside into leanness nor run up to corpulence. So basically, it's hard to stick to your target weight. Fair enough, I get that. But then we get, quote, unlike men, fat women are almost flabby from the fact that they can do little muscular work and will not exercise, unquote. Which, first off, untrue for readers of this paper at least, because they got that great exercise instruction right before this. Then, on the other hand, a woman who gains weight and then loses it all becomes, quote, one big wrinkle. And of course, there's only one thing a cultured woman fears more than wrinkles, and that is smallpox, unquote. But how does one become fat? Well, don't worry, they've got plenty of advice, and spoiler alert, it's mostly food-related. The author recommends a diet rich in both carbohydrates and fats, advocating for meat and vegetables with rich sauces or gravies, sweet fruits, milk instead of coffee or tea, as well as custards, marmalades, rice puddings, raisins, apples, all kinds of preserves, and sugar in any form. More extreme measures are proposed, such as a glass of cod liver oil before bed and fresh-drawn cow's blood, which, taken before breakfast, would, quote, cause Sarah Bernhardt herself to puff out like a cotton ball in 3 weeks, unquote. Sarah Bernhardt was a prominent French stage actress of the time and was actually one of the first actresses to make sound recordings and star in motion pictures. She was, coincidentally, a strict vegetarian for most of her life. Foods to avoid include acids of all kinds, pickles, spiced foods, mustards, and other condiments. For dessert, one is to avoid all pastries, including pies, rolls, tarts, and dumplings. However, it is noted that your diet should be more about quality, not quantity. Quote, gourmandizing is not only unnecessary, but absolutely pernicious to anyone desirous of being healthy. The digestive organs must be kept in a state of perfect activity, which cannot exist when the stomach is overloaded, unquote. Women wishing to gain weight are also encouraged to not drink ice water with meals, to bathe regularly but not in too hot or too cold of water, to sleep on a soft bed, get plenty of fresh air, and, quote, if the weather is cold, sponge the entire body with diluted glycerin, almond or olive oil, and keep the feet warm by the same process, unquote. Readers are also told to do light exercise, avoid excessive labor, the thing he said women don't do anyway, enjoy everything in moderation, and adopt a simple and tranquil mode of life. If, after all that, you do not, quote, find yourself expanding, abandon the scheme, and prepare to take your place among those who are lean and lank through the laws of heredity, unquote. Of course, I agree with the article in principle. One doesn't have to be thin to be attractive. 100% agreement on that, but you can also be skinny and attractive. It's not one or the other, obviously. But, of course, this was written in a time when, A, people were just thinner in general than most people are today, at least in developed countries. So what they considered fat and lean may not be exactly how we would think of it today. And B, all that being the case, at the time, excessive thinness would have been associated largely with being sickly or even having emotional disorders. And that's seen in how they're associating plumpness not just with physical attractiveness, but also with living a life of moderation and having a tranquil mood and all that. But moving on from how the Emmons County Record thought women could improve their figures, we shift dramatically to an article originally written for Harper's Magazine titled Uses of Arctic Exploration. The article is a defense of Arctic exploration in the wake of the Greely expedition, also known as the Lady Franklin Bay expedition, which readers would have just learned about in the summer of 1884. Basically, this was an expedition led by U.S. Army Lieutenant Augustus Greely that set off in 1881 with the mission of establishing a meteorological station and collecting scientific data. This was actually part of a larger international project called the First International Polar Year, in which 11 countries set out to establish 13 separate Arctic and subarctic research stations. The Greely team did succeed in that regard, establishing Fort Conger, or Fort Conger, I'm not sure, as the farthest northern human settlement at the time, but due to a breakdown in supply lines, including the sinking of a resupply ship, the men were forced to trek south through ice-choked seas in nothing but their small boats. By the winter of 1883, the men had reached Cape Sabine, where there was meant to be a substantial supply cache, but instead found only emergency supplies meant to last 40 days, not near enough for 25 men for the whole winter. By the time rescue ships arrived in June of 1884, only 7 men of the original 25 were left, including Lieutenant Greely, and one died several weeks later after multiple amputations due to frostbite. The writer George William Curtis argues that the Greely expedition was just one of several hundred conducted over the past 300 years, and that of the 500 men participating in the First International Polar Year, only 19 died. Curtis also points out that the scientific observations made by these expeditions will be remarkably beneficial, quote, doubling the world's knowledge of the magnetic forces, unquote, and leading to safer and more accurate global navigation, and therefore benefiting countless sailors and ship passengers worldwide. He then goes on in the typical Victorian manner to frame Arctic exploration as a moral achievement. Not only are the scientific advances important, but, quote, the patience, the courage, the self-denial, the faith, and the endurance developed by these northern researches are incomparable, unquote. Curtis even goes so far as to say that compared to Arctic explorers, chivalrous knights seem weak and superficial, and even the Crusades seem feverish and misguided. He concludes that though the Greely expedition ended in tragedy, it should not deter further expeditions, and instead inspire, as, quote, the Arctic story is one of the saddest, but also one of the noblest in the annals of human heroism, unquote. So, while it is a little minimizing of the recent deaths of 19 people, and I don't know that I'd call getting severe frostbite while slowly starving to death particularly noble, I understand the point. To a certain extent, when there's a new realm of exploration, there's going to be some mistakes, especially where nature and the universe is concerned. And yeah, that shouldn't deter humanity from exploring and learning and growing, etc. At the end of the last column, there is a short piece called Domestic Virtues that argues that every mother should teach their daughters how to keep their house in order, how to cook and bake, economize the household, how to sew and mend their husband's clothes, or whoever's clothes, right? And how to make their home comfortable, etc. This should be done so that when the daughter is grown and it doesn't have domestics, aka servants, she can make her family comfortable without them. If she does have servants, she can then teach them how to, quote, do things as they ought to be done, unquote, and effectively manage their work. And finally, there's a couple humorous snippets, including this one titled A Druggist's Blunder. A doctor says to his patient, "Well, how is your ague now?" "Worse and worse," replies the patient. "I've had the shakes awfully every day." "I can't understand that," says the doctor. "Did you take the medicine I prescribed you?" "Yes," says the patient, "but it did no good. You know, doctor, I think that medicine might do good if I took it before the shake come on instead of after." "Why, of course," says the doctor. "That is what I directed." "It did not say so on the bottle," replies the patient. "Consarn that druggist, what was on the bottle?" asks the doctor. "Well shaken before taken," replies the patient. And with that, we're done with page 2 of the Emmons County Record, and we move, naturally, on to page 3. So, page 3 starts out with a couple of poems taken from other publications. One is titled My Sweetheart, and the other Never Grow Old. I'm not going to read them because I am a terrible poetry reader. Most of the next 3 columns is taken up by a short story titled, Was It Flirting? Just real basically, the narrator, apparently a preacher from Glasgow named Hugh McTaggart, is recounting an episode from his youth when he was engaged to a young woman named Angelina Melville. Reverend McTaggart has been invited to preach in a small Scottish town for a few months while Angelina visits family on the West Coast. There, he's introduced to Deacon Stephensons, who he'll be staying with during his trip, and the deacon's daughter, Mary. Mary is very pretty and very lively in conversation, though nothing compared to his Angelina, of course. Well, over the course of several days, the young preacher begins to grow quite fond of Mary. He helps her pick blackberries, find a runaway cow, carry milk and groceries, all sorts of things he would never do back in the city with Angelina. Eventually, he finds himself asking for a kiss goodnight and holding her hand as they walk home from church on Sundays. No harm in that, he muses. He sees her more like a sister. Some time passes and Angelina returns to Glasgow, and McTaggart must soon return to her. It's then that he decides to tell Mary that he's getting married soon, and that he'll tell Angelina all about the wonderful friend he made during his time in the country. Mary is not happy about this. She lets go of his hand, tells him suddenly she's overtired, and goes to bed. She does not see Hugh the next day or the day after that, and she does not come to bid him goodbye when he returns to Glasgow. McTaggart returns to Angelina, but feels guilty about what happened with Mary, as he should. He tries to convince himself that he hadn't been flirting with her, and that even though he thinks about her all the time and misses her every day, it was just like a brother misses a sister, nothing more. He eventually writes to Mrs. Stevenson to check on Mary and receives a letter saying that Mary has taken ill. Shortly thereafter, at a fundraiser for his church, he sees the Stevensons' next-door neighbor who is visiting at Glasgow. He does not approach her, but overhears her talking with a companion about how Mary has taken sick, all because of, quote, that flirting young minister who broke her heart. The old lady goes on to say that Mary feels ashamed that she let herself be hurt and wishes she would just die rather than endure the heartbreak. However, the lady retorts that it's the minister who should be ashamed and declares aloud that Hugh McTaggart is a cold, cruel flirt. As it turns out, Angelina heard this entire thing, and she can see on Hugh's face that the story is true. Though he tries to talk his way out of it, she says she's actually relieved. Relieved that she found out before they got married, so she wouldn't end up with a man who apparently loved and broke the heart of another girl. But it's here that the story takes a saccharine turn. Apparently, both Hugh and Angelina are all the happier for breaking off their engagement. Hugh returns to the small town, tells Mary that he's broken things off with Angelina, loves her with all his heart, and wants to marry her instead. Mary, for her credit, tries to summon up her pride and refuse him, but it's no good. She just can't resist the charms of old Hugh McTaggart. Hugh and Mary live happily ever after, and Angelina marries someone named Mr. S. and lives a luxurious life in Glasgow, and there are absolutely no negative repercussions for anyone. The story ends with Hugh stating, "I have never been able to ask myself the question, did I flirt with Mary? If not, what was it? Well, I'll tell you, Hugh, it sounds a hell of a lot like flirting to me." Okay, so that was a much longer summary than I'd intended, so hopefully you're all still with me. Moving on from there, there's what's meant to be another humorous anecdote about a conversation between a Pullman car porter and a passenger titled, "He Studied Human Nature." I think I've talked about Pullman car porters before, but basically they were the attendants on railway sleeper cars for almost 100 years. And were almost exclusively black men, and would have been one of the most visible black professions to white Americans at the time. As such, the porter's dialogue is written in a heavily caricatured dialect with the kind of phonetic spelling and non-standard grammar that was used in 19th century newspapers and magazines to mock African American speech. I'm not going to read it out loud, of course, but basically, the porter asks a middle-aged passenger if he wants his bed made up already, since he'll probably be smoking another cigar in the smoking room. The passenger notes he had already smoked 3 cigars and had even remarked that he was feeling sleepy, but sure enough, in 5 minutes, he's back in the smoking room for another cigar. The passenger then asks the porter why he inquired about making up the bed. The porter goes on to tell him that he makes a point to remember every male passenger's little quirks and habits, and then jokes with them a little whenever they ride on his car. For example, if a man is particular about the ventilation, on the next trip, the porter will ask if the temperature is all right, and frequently jokes with men that they smoke the finest cigars ever smoked on his car. He also makes a point of doing this in front of other passengers to make it seem like the man he's speaking to is a frequent traveler or someone very important. The porter then quips that people say ladies like to be flattered, but they've got nothing on your average gentleman. The whole point, though, is that when he remembers them, they remember him. He declares that he'll probably make $100 a month just by studying human nature. And for reference, $100 would be about $3,300 in 2025, so not terrible. Also considering the fact that housing has far outpaced the rest of inflation, so that money would actually go quite a bit further. But also, this is apparently a fairly typical Pullman car porter anecdote that's found in these old newspapers. Being a visible profession, these porters were frequently seen as characters and are usually portrayed as witty but deferential, clever but not educated, and worldly but not authoritative, basically reflecting the expectations white people would have had for a good servant. And since these porters are usually portrayed as the smartest person in the story, it makes the heavily exaggerated dialect all the more jarring and ridiculous, since it was done not just to mock African-American speech patterns, but to really reinforce the racial hierarchies of the day and make it clear to the white readers that this black character might be smart, but he's still inferior to them. So, yeah, this is something that is uncomfortable, but would have been a very common story in newspapers of the time. But all that aside, it's really not a bad strategy, especially in a profession that basically relies on tips, as the Pullman car porters did. There's also a short little piece from author Olive Harper, who is a fascinating writer and author, real name Ellen Burrell D'Arpey, and this is titled Empress Eugenie and Her Son. It's basically just Olive musing about the ex-Empress of France, Eugenie, wife of Napoleon III, who had been deposed in 1870 after his defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, and her son, Louis Napoleon, who was killed fighting for the British in South Africa in 1879. Apparently, the ex-empress ate very little, but Louis more than made up for it. Olive then recounts when Louis had a plaster bust made by an artist at Shoeburyness School who messed up taking the plaster cast. The artist apparently made the prince's nose look like, quote, a gourd squash about a foot long, unquote. The artist continued on making the bust, however, and it is apparently in the mess room at Shoeburyness School and marked Napoleon IV. Olive then laments Louis' death in combat. He was stabbed 18 times by Zulu warriors after being dragged by his horse, and expresses her sympathy for the former empress. Editor Streeter is apparently not a fan of games of chance, as there's a snippet at the bottom of a column that reads, quote, "The greatest evil that now besets our people is the spirit of gambling. It takes form in thousands of ways and is even to be seen in some churches. If reaction does not occur, what will the end be?" Unquote. There is then a column titled Pith and Point, which contains more humorous little snippets and observations, such as Dr. Koch, having stated that the best precaution against cholera is to avoid the use of water, the health officers of Kentucky have declared that no quarantine is necessary. That's a whiskey joke if you didn't get that. Colorado has a woman who speaks 8 languages, but when her husband comes in at 3 a.m. with his legs hopelessly entangled, she doesn't deviate very far from the Colorado interpretation of plain English. "I've never seen such a woman in all my life," said Mr. Bass. "You are never satisfied with anything." "People who know the man I took for a husband," replied Mrs. Bass, "think on the contrary that I am very easily satisfied."
Boom. Roasted.
And finally, it is related of a jolly old sea captain who boards at one of the uptown hotels in Boston that in returning from a, quote, day at the shore, the landlord quietly suggested that one of the boys pilot him to his room. "Pilot?" said the mariner as he crammed his hat on the back of his head and, supporting himself against the counter, regarded his host with a fixed stare. "Pilots be damned, what I want's a lighthouse." A piece lifted from Tinsley's magazine advises readers to grind their own pepper using what they call table mills, which I 100% agree with. Although the writer says that they themselves chiefly use pepper as a garnish for melons, strawberries, and other fruit, which is not a habit I was familiar with. They declare that pre-ground pepper is an abomination with the consistency of Welsh snuff and should be discountenanced, which is not a word I was familiar with prior to reading this paper. And the rest of the page is mostly advertisements with a few little factoids sprinkled in, such as the British Medical Journal reports a well-authenticated case of a canary catching scarlet fever and dying. The Mason and Hamlin Company has manufactured their 150,000th organ. If arranged in a line, the organs would stretch from Grand Central Station in New York to within 20 miles of Springfield, Massachusetts. There is a house in Berlin, Weberstrasse number 16, which harbors no less than 140 families, numbering in all 1,025 souls. Honestly, I doubt that very much. South Carolina tea, cured in a fruit evaporator, has apparently been pronounced by experts to be equal to imported tea. And finally, Emperor William, and I think they mean Emperor Wilhelm I, is the oldest monarch in Europe. Alfonso of Spain is the youngest. And since they don't give us the ages, I will just tell you that Kaiser Wilhelm of Prussia would have been 87 years old at the time of printing, and King Alfonso XII of Spain would have been 27 years old. Unfortunately, King Alfonso wouldn't get much older. He died in 1885 of dysentery just before his 28th birthday. And that is going to do it for page 3. Now on to our fourth and final page. Page 4 is going to be a quick one, though, as it is almost entirely advertisements. Once again, these are mostly for Bismarck businesses, but there is an ad for the Emmons House Hotel in Williamsport, which George Walker, the proprietor, desires to inform land seekers, hunting parties, and the public generally that at his hotel they can find comfortable accommodations at reasonable rates. Those desiring to locate claims or those visiting the county seat on business will find every attention paid to their comfort at the Emmons House. There are good stable accommodations in connection with the hotel, and at the bar may be found good wines, liquors, and cigars, and the attention of the traveling and visiting public is always directed to this department. And there's also an ad actually just for Williamsport in general, which reads, "The town of Williamsport, the county seat of Emmons County, Dakota, is situated in one of the prettiest and most fertile regions of the territory. The county is being rapidly settled by an energetic and intelligent class of people, principally Americans, but there yet remain thousands of acres of the very finest quality of government land unentered within a few miles of Williamsport. There are also many excellent business openings in town. This season has been a remarkable one in the experience of settlers to the county, notwithstanding the fact that 16 months ago there was not a human habitation within 10 miles of Williamsport, yet today on every hand may be seen comfortable farmhouses and huge stacks of grain, the latter bearing evidence to the enormous crops which have been harvested this year. Buckwheat, flax, millet, timothy, and the finest vegetables have also been produced. For information regarding Williamsport, address Mackenzie and Coffin, Bismarck, Dakota Territory." And with that, we come to the end of the Wednesday, December 17th, 1884 edition of the Emmons County Record from now non-existent Williamsport, Dakota Territory. Of course, I wish there had been a bit more local news rather than having most of the paper taken up with stories and articles from elsewhere, but, this is a brand new town in a sparsely populated area, so can't really expect too much. I did kind of like the amount of humor that editor Streeter weaved into some of the local news, poking fun at other prominent citizens, that sort of thing, because I feel like that kind of gives you an extra peek into the mood and the mindset of the community at the time. So I hope you found that interesting as well, and if you did, please consider subscribing on whatever platform you listen on, and if you're still rushing out to buy Christmas presents, stop! Citizens of Emmons County, When you go to Bismarck to buy goods, don't forget that Cheap Jake, the poor man's friend, sells all articles cheaper than any other dealer in the city. At way down prices, you can purchase from him new and second-hand furniture, clothing, bedclothes, blankets, boots and shoes, hats and caps, coal stoves, wood stoves, guns and pistols, cheap watches, cheap jewelry, valuable watches and jewelry, and 1,000 different articles. Don't forget, Cheap Jake, the poor man's friend. Thanks again for listening. This has been Past and Printed. I've been your host, Loyd. Have a happy holidays, and I hope your next news is all good news.